Roman King Charlemagne had specific orders when he died on what to do. He had incredible wealth, incredible influence, incredible power, and in 814 BC, when he died at 72 years old, he told his crew, I want you to put me in the tomb, robed in royalty, a crown on my head, sitting on my throne with a scepter in my hand and a Bible open in my lap. And I want you to seal it off that no one should ever open it. Of course, that's what they did. They took him, they put him in the tomb, put a Bible on his lap. Almost 200 years later, there was a German emperor that wanted all the belongings, all the riches in there, and so he had the tomb opened. And there was Charlemagne, just as he requested. On his lap was opened a Bible with one bony finger pointing to Matthew 16:26. It says this, "For what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his soul?" And how true that is, a pertinent lesson as we look at Revelation chapter 18, the destruction of this great, powerful, influential city called Babylon. And there we see this reminder once again. That's this. This is the take home. Our hope and our home is not in this world and what it offers. One day, it's all going to burn. We've said that for centuries, right? Well, we're going to see it burn in some ways. Our true home is in heaven, and our real hope is in Jesus Christ. Because as you haven't, or as you maybe haven't figured out, there's nothing in this world that is stable. Everything changes. And man is crying out for stability that's only found in Christ. Revelation 17, we saw the religious Babylon and this one world false religious system that's ruling during the first half of the tribulation time. And the Antichrist himself decides, hey, I want to be God, and sets up a monument in the temple in Jerusalem, probably takes out this one world government. It says there in chapter 17:16 that they burn her with fire. And now in chapter 18, we see that Babylon is not just a religious system, but it is definitely a leading city in the time, full of commerce and such during the tribulation time, much like the actual Babylonian kingdom there in the 6th century. But toward the end of this tribulation, this city of Babylon is going to be judged by God for her sins. Totally destroyed. It really is that kaboom moment. You've heard of the A-bomb. This is the B-bomb. Babylon is going down. And so that's what we see here as we jump into this. Chapter 18, verse 1. He says, after these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. Let's stop there for a moment. So here we see this glowing angel coming down on the scene and crying out with this loud voice that Babylon the Great is fallen, twice. Why 2 times? Was he stuttering? Was it just that, for those who are hard of hearing, I'm telling it twice? Often you'll find in scriptures that when something is repeated, it's for great emphasis. It's to get our attention. We find in chapter 14 of Revelation, verse 8, that this same, another angel, a second angel flying in the heavens proclaiming Babylon's fall 2 times as well. And Isaiah even prophesied it way back in Isaiah 21, verse 9. Look, here comes a man in a chariot with a team of horses, and he gives back the answer, Babylon has fallen, and the images of its gods lie shattered on the ground. So when we see this, is fallen, it basically is telling us, emphasizing that both the religious system and the commerce economic downfall, it connects us with verse 6 of chapter 18, that there we again see the double portion given for her sins. But this is not a small thing in God's eyes. This is a total destruction of this city. It's a major thing, an incredible display of God's power, so much so that he says there in verse 2 that this city becomes a prison for every foul spirit and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. I mean, it is just a picture of how foul, there's my pun of the day, how foul these things have become. F-O-W-L for those that are short. It's destroyed. But Isaiah prophesied about this. Look at Isaiah 13. He says, Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. There no nomads will pitch their tent. There no shepherds will rest their flocks. But desert creatures will lie there. Jackals will fill her house. There the owls will dwell, and there the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will inhabit her strongholds. Jackals, her luxurious palaces. Her time is at hand, and her days will not be prolonged. AKA, only crickets are chirping. It is gone. But why such a harsh sentence does God have for this? Well, in verse 3, we note there that she's led people away from God through all her idolatry and her immorality and destroying God's people. She pulled people under her luxurious riches and influence of these merchants from afar. And the warning really becomes for us in our day that in every generation we as Christians have to be careful of the sirens, you might call them, of the world system. The sirens they're like a three-part harmony of the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, that call out to us, singing their song to us to steal our attention, to rob that devotion for the Lord. To get so caught up in the world's system, whether it's philosophies or even materialism or different things like that's where you want to find your security. And God says, no, that's not what I have for you. Because God has something better for us. Heaven. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 through 17 says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. And Jesus said in Matthew 6 that you can't serve two masters. You hate one and you love one and despise the other. He says you cannot serve God and mammon. So I must be careful, I must be on my guard so I don't fall into that sin of striving for those things. A young man once approached his girlfriend, and he said to her, I can't promise you a yacht, a big house, a Rolls Royce, as Johnny Green could, but I can promise you all my love. And his girlfriend turned to him and said, oh, that's so sweet. I love you too, but tell me more about Johnny Green. It's not wrong, obviously, to have money. Poverty is not connected with godliness. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, does the money have me? Is that my controlling ideal in the world that I live in for my life? Is my heart wrapped up in the Lord who is over all this world or in the things of this world? Is he first? Is he foremost? Or is he just a part of my life? The Lord wants to be over your whole life. He wants to be in charge. And you often know by how tight a grip you have on stuff, or how tight a grip this stuff has on you. Because Jesus said, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. It's something for us to consider. So after the angel gives this proclamation of judgment, a voice from heaven calls out this invitation in verse 4 to escape the coming judgment. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. God has always had this call for the righteous to come out of the world and be separate, be different. Noah was called out before the judgment fell. Lot was called out of Sodom and Gomorrah before judgment came there as well. And this command is really, in Revelation 18, is really no different. God is calling people out of that system before judgment falls. In Jeremiah chapter 51, we find the same thing was given to those in Babylon before it was destroyed in the 5th century. Jeremiah 51 verse 6, "Flee from Babylon, run for your lives. Do not be destroyed because of her sins. It is time for the Lord's vengeance. He will repay her what she deserves." And chapter 51 verse 45 says, "Come out of her, my people, run for your lives, run from the fierce anger of the Lord." It wasn't a time to, hey, let's think about it. Let's ponder it. Maybe we can put that on the agenda for next month's board meeting. It was time to act upon it. It was time to do something about it in the now. And that's so important for us. But notice who the invitation to is, come out of her, what? My people. My people, those who were saved during the tribulational time, claiming him as Lord and Christ. That's who he's directing to. You see, even true believers in the end times can get caught up in the materialism and sin that the world is presenting. Paul would use this aspect of calling out of the world when he wrote to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 6. He says this, "Therefore, come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you, and I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty." So what's he implying? We come out of the world system, from the world, into a relationship with the living God. Of course, we can't leave the physical world, but we can fix our hearts totally to him. And why should we do this? Well, he says there in verse 4, lest you share in her sins, so you become spiritually polluted by her influence. And number 2, lest you receive of her plagues, which means the results are not good. But a judgment is going to fall upon sin. It's only a matter of time. And he says there in verse 5, why? Because her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. The people of Babel, you remember in Genesis 11, built a tower to God, to the heavens. God says, the only thing that's been built up to me is your sins. And they've reached that point where judgment now falls. Verse 6, render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mix double for her. In the measure that she glorifies herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and I am no widow, and I will not see sorrow. God renders his judgments in justice and in truth, in all fairness. In this case, there's kind of a double portion at God's hand, showing the severity of this sin that's taking place. Isaiah said this again in Isaiah 47. He predicted this humiliation. He says, now then, listen, you lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, I am, and there is none besides me. I will never be a widow or suffer the loss of children. Both of these will overtake you in a moment, on a single day, the loss of children and widowhood. They will come upon you in full measure. In spite of your many sorceries and all your potent spells, you have trusted in your wickedness and have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, I am, and there is none beside me. Disaster will come upon you, and you will not know how to conjure it away. A calamity will fall upon you that you cannot ward off with a ransom. A catastrophe you cannot foresee will suddenly come upon you. So again, the prediction of the doom that's happening. In verse 8, therefore her plagues will come in one day. That's how fast this is going to happen. You're here one moment, gone the next. Death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. You see, God's delays in dealing with sin does not mean that he's just A-okay with things. He's not disinterested in it. He will judge sin in his time, in his righteous way. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And it's good for us to know, because we want to have a short account of sins in our life. When we get off track, we want to come back to the Lord and say, God, you know what? I blew it. That attitude, that action, that issue, man, I just didn't respond right. Lord, thank you for the cross, and thank you for the blood that restores me right back into that place of fellowship. I just confess this to you, Lord. But what we're seeing here is a city that in their pride and in their arrogance and in their own selfishness, she says, it'll never happen to me. And God says, yes, it will. Look how this destruction falls and how the world responds. Verse 9. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you. And all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing and saying, alas, alas, the great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by ships, sailors, and many as trade on the seas, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like this great city? They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing and saying, alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. You might note 3 things about this section, the reactions. First of all, note who is lamenting with deep wailings. It is the kings of the earth, verse 9 tells us. It is the merchants of the earth, verse 11. The shipmasters and the traders in verse 17. All those who were caught up in her idolatrous ways, her immoral living, her political influence, her materialism. From the greatest to the smallest, they realize the gravity of this judgment. This is heavy. This is catastrophic. Life has changed. From here on out, you might say, it'll never be the same. And they say in verse 10 and verse 16 and verse 19, alas, alas, which means woe. There's this bitter anguish cry at the deep loss that's taking place and the fearful expectation. But what's interesting is what is described in verses 8 through 10, it really sounds a lot like what we would equate to like a nuclear attack on this city. Listen, it's burned with fire, just as the religious Babylon was burned with fire by the hands of men in chapter 17, verse 16. The plagues of death and famine are there. They see the smoke of her burning and stand at a distance for fear of her torment in verses 9 and 10. I mean, that's kind of like, hey, we don't want to get too close because radioactive stuff's happening there. Possibly, we don't know. But secondly, note what they are crying over. The focus in this section of their weeping is not for the citizens of Babylon. It's for the possessions, the riches that they can't get anymore. They're crying out over their own financial loss, showing you just how deep the materialism was their God. And you know, we can see this today. Men can chase after the God of money. I mean, we just went through, maybe you purchased a ticket, I don't know, but $1.2 billion lottery. Good grief. But it just shows you men's desires and heart to think that if I have that, everything will be so much better and I'll truly be happy. And many times it doesn't happen that way. We end up destroying life in a pursuit of it. This is what Jesus said. He said to them in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. It's a good thing for us to remember. 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10, Paul says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money, not money itself, but the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. You see, the true riches that God looks at, that you want to strive for, is not measured by the material things around you. It's measured in your service unto the Lord. When you stand before him, he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And that's something that we need to look at, we need to strive for as well. Verse 12 through 13 list some of the wealthy inventory that was found in this city. There's 27 different items in 6 arenas. They're all luxuries, not necessities. But just to run through, there's gems of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls. There's garments of fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet. There's items to build and decorate in extravagance. This citron wood was used for decorative cabinets, and ivory and precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble. There's items for personal pampering when he talks about cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense from all over the world. There's food and festivities, the party platter of wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep are there. And then there is the military might, horses and chariots and bodies and souls of men. Interesting, they're weeping. The merchants are weeping over the bodies and souls of men. A reference to the slavery or selling people for the sake of personal gain. You see, in the context, in the Roman world, you can find that a third of the Roman world were slaves. Upwards of 50 million slaves. It was not uncommon to have 10,000 slaves sold in one day. And so they would have connected with this. People were sold. And sometimes we think, oh, that's outlawed or that's a past thing. Well, let me remind you that there are 40.3 million victims of human trafficking around the world today. In an industry that brings in $150 billion a year. You think, oh, that would never happen. I'm sorry, it is happening. The bodies and souls of men are still being sold. The third thing you might note is how quickly it all went down. In chapter 18, verse 10, the second half, it all happens in 1 hour. In 1 hour. In verse 19, it says, in 1 hour, such great riches came to nothing. In 1 hour, she's made desolate. This city went from having the title, best place to live in the world, to run. You don't want to be here. It's the worst city in 1 hour. And isn't it amazing that sometimes we can get so caught up in building this kingdom, building this security, this palace in this world, whatever it might be, we can get so caught up into building these things only to find out that, well, God could take it all down in a fleeting moment. I mean, you look at things. It could be a health issue. It could be an accident. It could be a market crash. And everything you've worked for decades just goes crumbling down. We find our security in Jesus Christ. We find our rest in him. And we hold on to the things of this world very lightly. Jesus said in Matthew 6, seek first the kingdom of God. Put him as the priority and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. What things? The needs that you have every day. You see, God is a good carer of his kids. He's able to care for his kids. Now, you may be saying this morning, you may have just gone through a situation. I'm not sure how this bill's going to get paid. I'm not sure how this issue is going to happen. I'm not sure all those things. And you may be a little bit anxious, worried, or even deathly afraid. I want to encourage you, seek the Lord. Go to God not as the ATM to say, okay, God, you got to take care of this. Go to God and say, Lord, my life is in your hands. You knew about these issues and these bills and these situations before they ever came this way to me, because you're the God who sees everything. And so, Lord, I'm trusting you that you not only will care for this in your way and your time and your know-how, but ultimately my heart to be at peace and at rest because, God, you're still in control. And maybe you just need that word from the Lord even this morning to say, hey, stop fretting. Stop worrying. Your God who created everything has got you tightly in his hands. He bought you with his blood, and you think he's going to let you go? I encourage you to look back on how God has provided for you. Look back on how the God who loves you has sustained you, has given you promises. If the same God then did great things, why would he not do great things now? It may not be what you think he should do. You're not God. But it will be what he wants to do so that you can trust him to keep walking with him to ultimately see his character and his life built in you. Keep going forward with him. No one gets to heaven, by the way, and says, I wish I built a bigger bank account. No one gets to heaven and says, man, I wish I had that house, or why didn't I have that in the world? No one says that. Probably the reoccurring line will probably be, why didn't I minister out more freely with what God put into my hands? All of us in that same boat. Not in condemnation, but Lord, help me to see the opportunities and you use me. So the wicked are weeping, but look at verse 20. The righteous are rejoicing. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. And this is good to note that God avenges his people who have been through the sufferings and have been at the hands of that persecution. Jeremiah predicted it long ago, Jeremiah 51. A destroyer will come against Babylon. Her warriors will be captured and their bows will be broken, for the Lord is a God of retribution. He will repay in full. God hears. Verse 21. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, thus with violence the great city of Babylon has been thrown down and shall not be found anymore. So God is now he takes this millstone, and you think, well, what is a millstone? It was a sign, it was a big heavy stone used to grinding at the mill. And Jesus said, hey, if you caused one of these little ones to stumble, it'd be better for you to take a millstone, tie it around your neck, and throw yourself into the sea. Now, you may have great swimming skills. You ain't going to handle this. It's like throwing a 2,000-pound weight and, you just sink to the bottom of Lake Mead and they'll find your bones in 2022. I'm just saying that it was a point of permanence. It was a point of finality. And it goes back to Jeremiah chapter 51. Jeremiah's word to one of the king's servants is this: when you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the Euphrates. Then say, so will Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster I will bring on her, and her people will fall. The words of Jeremiah end here. So that's the connection there. But he says in verse 22, the sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. And the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. For by your sorcery all the nations were deceived, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth. Babylon is utterly destroyed. No more. No more of the materialism and her influence and power to deceive others and her vicious assault upon God's people. And we're going to see in chapter 19 next week how heaven rejoices over this. But it has often been said, well, what city is this? This Babylon that he's talking about here. Some have proposed that it's the actual literal city of Babylon that was located on the Euphrates River, though it would be hard to see it burn from the coast, which is over 200 miles away. It was once the center for all kinds of prosperity and immorality. It fell in 539 BC to the Persians, finally destroyed by Alexander the Great in 330 BC, and it never recovered to its former glory. Back in the day, you remember Saddam Hussein, that rascal. He started rebuilding the city of Babylon, saw himself as the second Nebuchadnezzar, great king, and wanted to revive it back. He started rebuilding it. It's actually, today, they're trying to rebuild it as a place of world tourism and wealth. I want to show you a few pictures. If you went there today, this is what you would see. Just walls trying to rebuild it, gates, monuments of lions. That was kind of their thing, was the lion. And so just that's what you see today. But in Isaiah chapter 13 and Jeremiah 50 and 51, the indication is that the literal Babylon city will never be rebuilt, destroyed forever as a testimony of God's judgment. So we kind of have to wait and see what happens. Maybe the Babylon of Revelation 18 is kind of a new Babylon that's moved closer to the coast, and the Antichrist sets up his headquarters there. I don't know. That would, in a sense, make sense that the prophecy of the old Babylon would never be rebuilt and inhabited. It would be completely destroyed and just a monument. I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. Some people have thought that this Babylon is not the city of Babylon. It's actually New York City. Because it's predominant city in America. It's located on the coast. It has global trade. It's very luxurious. It's chief in promoting all kinds of filth and sin throughout the world. And I would tell you that America is Babylon-esque, just as many other cities in the world are. But I personally believe that America is not in the end times picture. Why? I think the possibilities are, one, that the rapture, and when that occurs, that you could have over half of the population of America gone, and immediately overnight, along with the rest of the world, it's just thrown into this chaos, and we don't have the influence and power anymore. The second option is that we just implode as a country. I've seen it, or you've seen all the anger and angst around, and and politics would divide, and we would have states that are now nation states that don't have the military might, and we've just imploded as a country. Or the third option is just a nuclear war, and they've wiped us out, and we're in heaven. I don't know, but America doesn't seem to be in the picture here. And so that's just my point of view. And so we were talking about it earlier. When you see all these things happening and things seem to be just sinking and inflation happening and this, that, and the other, hey, you know what? Hold on to Jesus. Be at peace, because ultimately you got heaven. You're not building a kingdom here. Hang on to him. He's coming back. The others have said, no, it can't be the real Babylon, and it can't be America. It has to be Rome, because Rome sits on the coast of Italy, definitely a ruling city of John's day, both religiously, politically, economically, militarily, the heart of the Roman Empire. And if that be the case, then chapter 17 focuses on the fall religiously, and chapter 18 focuses on the fall economically. Both 17 and 18, there's some similar characteristics. They've caused the nations of the world to be drunk with fornication. They have the blood of the saints on them. They're extremely wealthy, and both are burned with fire as a judgment. Today, we can't be 100% certain which city it is. We'll leave it up to the scholars to debate. But I'll tell you this. During the tribulation time, these people have no doubt which city that is. They have no doubt about it. And they know, we can know, that God is going to judge sin. So lastly, I want to give you just 3 little take-home lessons that we can see in this chapter. One is to watch out that your heart isn't led astray by the things of the world. Be on guard. Check your heart every once in a while. Make sure the Lord is first and foremost. Nothing compares to Jesus, so keep him first. Number 2, respond to God's invitation to his people to come out of the sin of the world and share in his true riches in life before the judgment falls. He calls you into deep fellowship with him. And maybe it's a point of examination in your own life. Are you in fellowship with the Lord? Or is Christianity just a title to profess because I need to claim some religion? Be in fellowship with God. Cultivate that relationship that's so rich, so wonderful. And third, live for what's going to last forever. Act like a citizen of heaven, not a citizen of Babylon. Build up his kingdom. Lay up your treasures in heaven and not this earth. Have a light touch on the things of this earth and have a great grip on the things of God. Jesus paid the price for us to bring us into his family. And he gives out that invitation. To those who don't know him, he calls us in. Come. To those who do know him, he often says, remember. Right? And we come back to that table where we remember what Jesus did for us. And it's always a great fresh start to have communion together as a church. before the Lord together, it's a good thing. But if you've never made that decision to accept Christ, then I want to give you that opportunity now before we take communion together, okay? So let's bow our heads.